Welcome to Insight Out, an NOV podcast where we share a unique view on energy markets, business trends, and leadership perspectives. I'm Assaad Mohana, I'm Director of Business Strategy here at NOV, and I'm glad you are joining us. Right around this year, or this time last year, the world was forced to change in ways we never thought would happen. COVID-19 pandemic swept around the world, causing nationwide lockdowns, an unprecedented drop in oil demand, estimated at tens of millions of barrels per day, and global markets went to a full stop. But a year ago, also, we saw Brent crude prices drop from $65 a barrel to low 20s, and we even saw WTI go into negative territory. But today, almost a year later, almost exactly a year later, actually, we're seeing oil prices pick back up, and the S&P 500 76% from where it was in its bottom, topping the best year ever, even better than the 2009 recovery. After several trillions of dollars injected into economies and an ongoing vaccination campaign around the world, we're seeing the recovery happen, but in many ways, some things will never be the same. On this 51st episode of the show, we're joined by a very special guest. She is a global energy icon, an economist, and a geopolitics expert. And she has great perspective on those dynamics and energy markets. Joining us from Black Forest in Germany, the CEO of Crystal Energy, also my countrywoman, Dr. Carole Nakhle. Carole, welcome to Insight Out.
Hello, Assaad. Thank you for having me with you today.
It's great to have you, Carole. First of all, tell us a little bit about where Black Forest is.
It's in Germany, on the borders with France, near Strasbourg, and it's a really fantastic place and super sunny that I had to add bed sheets to the window so that you can see me properly.
That's so good. That is so cool. I love it. Carole, tell us a little bit about yourself and about Crystal Energy for those who do not know.
I'm Carole Nakhle. As I said, I come from Lebanon, but I've been living in the UK, except for this year because of COVID. We're temporary in Germany, but I've been living in the UK since 1998. Originally, I went there for 1 year to do a master's in finance, and living there for, I think, almost more than two decades. And Crystal Energy, I set up in 2012. We specialize in energy market analysis and policy advisory, research, and training. In addition to Crystal Energy, I'm also the founder of a non-for-profit group, which is called Access Women Energy, and I've been the director of the group since 2007.
That is so impressive. Thank you. Yeah. Impressive background, and it seems like you've taken this path of uncovering and unwrapping what's going on, the dynamics in our industry, which is great to hear, and I look forward to knowing more. Carole, I'd like to start with your perspective on market outlooks. I think what we saw in the last several months is an impressive pickup in oil prices, starting perhaps November when the vaccine was out. What do you think of that, and is that supported by fundamentals?
You said it, Assaad, about the recovery in prices, in oil prices, has been quite impressive, because if you look at the major episodes in the history of the oil industry where we had massive drops in prices, and what we saw last year was pretty unique because we had a major market crude WTI turning negative in April 2020. So that was pretty unique. But usually, if you look at previous, I wouldn't say similar crises because they were not perhaps at the same extent as what we saw with COVID-19 in 2020, but usually it would take at least 18 months for prices to get close to their pre-crisis levels. Here we had, in less than a year, which is quite impressive, quite an achievement, prices recovering to levels that we saw before COVID-19 hit globally, because of course it started in Asia, but then where we felt it in Europe was around, and in the rest of the world point, of course, was around March 2020. So the oil prices that we are seeing today are at the same levels as we saw early 2020. Of course, a lot of the credit goes to OPEC plus a group of non-OPEC producers that came together in December 2016. Because for those of you who remember, 2014, we also had a collapse in prices, mainly because of the shale revolution in the US, and OPEC found support from some non-OPEC producers led by Russia, and they succeeded in putting a floor on prices, and they increased them to certain levels between 2016 up to 2020. And then 2020, April 2020, they announced a historic production cuts, a deal of almost 10 million barrels a day, actually to be precise, 9.7 million barrels a day. That is massive. And they've been in this partnership. So they announced their deal for 2 years. So it goes until April 2022. And of course, they made some changes and tweaks to the schedule. But I say that in my opinion that they take most of the credit for the rapid recovery in price. And of course, you add to that the recovery in the global economy, in oil demand, because we're not in strict lockdowns. I mean, I know here in Germany, for example, there are still lots of restrictions on mobility, but they are not of the same scale as we saw in April last year. That was, something pretty unique to all of us. So on balance, the fundamentals support prices where they are today. But if OPEC Plus is, for example, did not make these massive cuts, I think the recovery would have taken much longer. And the big question, Assaad, is not where we are today, but what's going to happen next.
And you read my mind. What is going to happen next if we break it down into perhaps a short term and a long term?
Yeah, I mean, an economist, I always think about different time frames. That's why when people throw numbers here and there about oil price outlook, it pays a lot to look at the period that they are concentrating on. Some people look at, for example, the fourth quarter of the year. Others talk about the average for this year. And therefore, you have a big disparity in a price forecast for this year and the coming years. I don't do price forecasting, especially not in today's environment, climate, where we are seeing massive volatility in prices. I mean, just to give you an idea, if you look at February, for instance, in 1 week we had prices shooting up by 8%, the other week dropping by 11%, then increasing by another 10 percentage point, and very recently they dropped by 13 percentage points. So we are on a roller coaster because there are lots of uncertainties around. Remember, what caused the problem where we are today is COVID-19, and that problem is still with us. Yes, we are able to manage the pandemic better than before, but it is still spreading at rapid rate, and vaccination did not really pick up everywhere at the same speed. So we have a handful of countries, small and large alike, that are doing a great job. I mean, where you're sitting in the US and the UK, for example, they are doing fantastic job. But where I am sitting, they are doing a dreadful job in terms of the rollout of vaccination. And think about the poorer countries where vaccination hardly started. So we're talking about very uneven outlook, and that creates a lot of uncertainty with respect to the demand. Not only that, I think one of the main missing ingredient when it comes to our forecast of oil demand in particular is demand for jet fuels or flying around. Everybody expected that we're all going to jump on a plane during the summer holidays and then go all around the world. But you saw what Japan, for example, announced recently, that they are going ahead with the Olympics, but they're not going to allow international visitors. The UK, in the same way, they are still putting if you want, a moratorium on traveling for holidays for non-essential reasons outside the country. So while we started the year, for example, with a lot of excitement about the outlook for the summer, people are now having second thoughts about maybe the holiday season is not going to be as exciting as many people expected. And as a result, what we have today, we have really very divergent views between with respect to oil price forecasts for the rest of the year. So on the one hand, you have particularly the financial institutions, banks, talking about a super cycle, commodity super cycle, where prices will continue to rise and rise and rise, and then stay
Right.
up a high level for a while before perhaps declining. But on the other hand, we have agencies such as International Energy Agency
Yeah.
warning that such a thing does not apply in oil markets today because of a whole range of uncertainties. I tend to subscribe to the second view because I can see you have still economic uncertainty, you have the COVID-19 uncertainty, you have the oil demand uncertain outlook, and also you have on the supply side lots of uncertainty. Going beyond that, of course, there again, I find it hard to see the commodity super cycle taking place in oil markets because it's not just about a strong economic recovery and therefore a strong oil demand recovery. You have to think about the supply side. I mean, OPEC
Right.
Plus is sitting on more than 8 million barrels a day of spares capacity. Will they continue to hold it for how long? Then add to that potential increase in supply, particularly in the US, and then also other suppliers might come on stream. So many moving parts, and therefore we have to tread carefully when we are forecasting the future development in prices. But at the moment, I can tell you, expect volatility to continue.
And maybe a reminder that we didn't exactly come out of a very robust market either in 2016. It was a pretty rough ride. We were still coming out from the 2014-15 crash. So pretty troubling task to get out from where we were.
Actually, Asad, I'm glad you mentioned that because, we tend to focus on very short-term movements in prices and oil prices. But for me, this doesn't tell me much. This may be great for traders, but you don't base your investment decision, especially in conventional oil, on daily movement in prices. So you get a more complete picture when you look at a longer period of time, when you look at the trend. And it's interesting when you look at oil prices for the last maybe 10 years or 11 years. So if you look from 2010 to 2000 to now to 2021, you can see that actually since 2014, oil prices have been stuck in a lower price band than what we had before. So OPEC Plus succeeded in lifting prices up a little bit after 2016, but we're still not back to the levels that we saw in 2011 or 2012 or 13. So I'm glad you mentioned that because it's important to look at the bigger picture, not really trace daily price movements.
Carole, I want to kind of get your thoughts on a subject that is tied into the crisis clearly, but maybe the stimulus packages, and more precisely, the impact of these massive injections into economies. Is there something to be concerned about, and how does that tie into oil and gas?
Look, I would be concerned of anything which is of the scale of what we saw recently because of the COVID-19 crisis all around the world. I mean, we heard of numbers perhaps that we hardly heard of before, at least in recent memory. And then you wonder, so of course that was needed because we had, to quote the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, that was a crisis like no other, and therefore you need to do something quite unconventional. So the recent fiscal stimulus package announced in the US, 1.9 trillion US dollars, and that was the second, massive injection into the economy. And the same thing you find all around the world. Government had to play a big role in supporting the economy. So did central bank as well. Around the world. Now, of course, that was needed, but this raises many question marks, and more people are coming out expressing concerns about the longer term impact of these packages. So particularly in the US, where you are, Assaad, there is this big debate about the risk of inflation, because when you look at the amount of money that has been injected in the economy, that is massive. And usually if it exceeded, for example, the scale of the problem, that's what some people are saying, that the problem, yes, is big, but actually, when you look closely, you can see that it wasn't as big as some expected it to be or portrayed it to be. So they are warning that at some point, the excess of money injected in the economy is going to heat up prices. And usually you have this kind of inflationary pressure it backfires because it leads to economic problems further down the line, and then it slows down economic growth, and then you can even reverse some of the gains that you achieved with those. But there's also another dimension. If you look at governments all around the world, they are highly indebted, and then you ask, where are they going to generate the revenues to compensate, to pay back that debt? And we already started to hear governments, for example, in the UK, in Australia, and even in the US, you hear governments talking about potentially increasing taxes to start paying back some of that massive, to cover that massive hole in their budget. And here I want to raise alarm bells for the oil industry in particular, because you see, I started my career as a tax specialist in the oil and gas industry, and usually when you have government's budgets under pressure, typically the answer is, or the reaction is, higher taxation on oil companies. And today you can easily get away with it as a government, because you wouldn't expect much sympathy from the general public if you squeeze more revenues out of the oil companies. So this is one area that I'm personally watching closely, because that will translate to a higher cost on doing business. And this takes me to an additional point, if I may make here. I know we are all concerned when prices go down, oil prices go down, but actually high prices can also spell trouble. Not only they bring cost inflation, if you're talking about whether operating costs or capital expenditure, but they also attract the taxman. So typically we find governments increasing their fiscal take, to be more accurate, rather than just using the term tax, because tax is very limited in terms of definition. But the overall revenues that they get out of the industries, they tend to increase the fiscal take when prices are high. So there's also, a blessing and a curse with each development in markets.
Right. Very powerful message there, Carole. Is that why? So what I'm hearing is inflation is not only the only result of these stimulus packages, but greater oil prices, as well as these checks that are being distributed, could cause more taxation on oil companies, because it's less of a resistance in today's market. Is that why we're seeing European oil companies maybe drive towards the energy transition faster than other oil companies around the world?
Yes and no, but actually the energy transition, or the greener portfolio that the oil majors, particularly in Europe, are adopting, did not really start only with COVID-19. So that started before that, where these companies acknowledge, I mean, if you're a business and you want to maintain your survival for many years to come, you cannot turn a blind eye on the massive tsunami that is hitting the whole world, the globe, and that is climate change. And whether you're a climate believer or climate denier, that's a different story. But there's something on the ground happening here, that governments all around the world are adopting more and more policies that support the energy transition, the transition to a greener, cleaner future, and less reliance on fossil fuels, particularly oil and gas. And of course, you add to that coal. So there is a trend happening out there. There are shareholders who are saying, we will not put our money in businesses which are, they call dirty, because they are producing these carbon emitting gases. So you have the shareholders, you have the civil societies, you have the people in the street. We saw protests around the world before COVID. So all that has been happening before, before COVID, and it's still ongoing. And COVID may have shed more light on the problem. There are more talks about the energy transition and accelerating the energy transition. So oil companies, as responsible business that are producing a crucial product for to sustain our modern societies, they cannot turn a blind eye on that. Now, of course, in terms of speed, you don't have all the companies going at the same speed. I can see that the European companies are a bit ahead in that respect than the American companies, for instance. That has to do with many things. Organizational culture is one of them, but also I would add to that, and this relates to your question, the government policy in what we see in Europe, in the EU, and in the UK are much more aggressive when it comes to climate change than what you see in North America, for instance. You have environmental taxes, you have the carbon trading scheme that provide more incentive for companies to embrace the energy transition. That said, we have to be careful because at the end, these companies, they are oil and gas producing businesses. So at their core, they remain oil and gas producers, but they will try to minimize the impact of their production on on the consumption of their products on the environment. And this is where we're seeing a diversification in their portfolio. That said, allow me to add one thing. And for those of you who are curious, the International Energy Agency published in January 2020 a report on the investment trend within the industry, and they covered both national oil companies and private oil companies. And they found a striking, they reached a striking conclusion that between 2015 and 2019, all these companies that they surveyed hardly spend any money on their green agenda compared to the money that they are spending on oil and gas. And therefore, so we have to put whatever announcements these companies are making into perspective, how much of that is going into, let's say, green projects versus how much of that is going in oil and gas. It's not for us to say whether it's right or wrong. At the end, again, I repeat what I said earlier, that they are producing a product that is still in demand and will continue to be in demand for many years to come.
Very powerful message there too, Carole. For those just joining us, this is NOV Insight Out with Carole Nakhle from Crystal Energy. Carole, I want to talk a little bit about the subsidies we're seeing, or the government support that oil and gas gets, as well as the renewable world. How are those different, do you think?
Wow, that's a massive topic and highly controversial. And I'm sure lots of people out there are going to disagree strongly with me. But it's a subject that is very close to my heart, and I've been working on it for years. I need to clarify a few things first. When it comes to subsidies on the oil and gas sector, often and typically the main focus of various studies that you find out there is on subsidies for consumption and not subsidies that go to production. Actually, if you want to go back to the basic definition of subsidies, and this is where you have lots of ambiguities and gray areas when people talk about subsidies that go into production of oil and gas, there is no single definition adopted for subsidies when it comes to the production of oil and gas. So there seems to be a bigger consensus in terms of the subsidies that go into consumption for oil and gas. And it's true, they are quite pronounced all around the world, particularly in the developing countries, for different reasons, especially if you look at the oil and gas producing countries in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. Because governments in those countries, they believe that this is one way of them of redistributing the oil wealth by providing very cheap, almost free oil products to their people. Again, I can see where they are coming from, but again, as an economist, any kind of subsidies is inefficient. It leads to inefficient consumption and wasteful consumption. That's what we find in countries where they have this kind of subsidies. You find that their local demand is growing at a high rate, not because their economy is booming or their population is booming, but because of the wasteful consumption. Here I was told, I teach, in addition to my commercial hat, I teach at the university, and used to tell my students that I lived in Abu Dhabi for a while, and in addition to being in the UK. So in the UK, before I left my apartment, I would go and switch off all the lights because I was paying a lot of money for the electricity. In Abu Dhabi, it was almost free of charge. So I had a big house, and leaving the lights on, wasn't a big concern, though I had to say, Carole, you have to practice what you preach, and I would go back and switch the lights off. So price signal is very, very important to adjust people's behavior. So this takes me to the subsidies on consumption, and I'm still in oil and gas. Subsidies on production, again, it's a very, very controversial area. Just look at several studies, maybe two or three, targeting one country, and looking at oil and gas production subsidies, you find that the estimates that they put on these subsidies are massively different. And this is because they had a different interpretation of what subsidies are. I don't want to go through the technical jargon here, but I would say treat this concept with a lot of care. You have to understand the fiscal regime that applies on the oil and gas in the activities before rushing into making general conclusions on whether the oil and gas industry is subsidized or not. But any kind of subsidies, in my opinion, are inefficient. And this takes me to the question, the other side of the question, which is very controversial. The issue of subsidizing renewable energy. I know costs are going down massively, but renewable energy in general still requires government support. And typically, industries which rely hugely on government support take time to pick up. And here I'm thinking, for example, if I were to compare two perhaps very different sectors in terms of government support, the nuclear industry or nuclear energy and just shale industry, one purely private and the other one requires a lot of government support, and you can see which one grew faster. So as long as renewable energy continues to rely on government support, I fear that whatever targets we're talking about in terms of its spread all around the world and making a huge difference to our primary energy mix all around the world may not be easily achieved. So I hope we reach a point where we don't need any more government support for the green energy source. And here I put all sorts of green energy sources, not just renewable energy.
It sounds like what I'm hearing from you, Carole. There's renewables right now cannot walk on its own. Costs are dropping, however, making it more and more competitive. But the future looks like more of a mixed energy basket than one of the two.
And again, Assaad, if I may add to this area, and this is where I told you it's controversial, is how do we measure those costs? Are you talking only about the electricity generation, for example? Are you talking about the full, let's say, system cost? And again, this is where you have to go through the nitty-gritty details to have a more learned understanding of the competitiveness, let's say, of one source of energy versus another, because typically people tend to focus only on one aspect, that is, let's say, the cost of electricity generation, but that can be a little bit misleading or not providing the full picture.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about how oil and gas is an easy target for taxation. What do you advise your clients when it comes to pure play oil companies to do in the face of this energy transition and the potential tax?
Look, we deal with all sorts of clients, and actually we have more government clients, I would say, than private sector. And it's a question that governments themselves, host governments, come and ask because, mind you, especially when we talk about the fiscal regime, many of these fiscal regimes, when they were designed, they were agreed on and contracts signed, and they were under different circumstances than what they are today. And in some countries, you have the flexibility to change, say, the legislation, and this would apply on everyone in the industry across the board, so you don't discriminate between investors. But in other countries, such as in the developing world, you have perhaps each contract negotiated individually, and the terms of the contract are quite different, let's say, from those signed with another investors. Not only that, some contracts, they contain what we call stabilization provisions, which means that they would lock in the terms of the contract for the whole duration of the contract. So whatever happens, let's say, with your tax system, including you want to include carbon tax, for instance, that contract will remain immune. And of course, as a sovereign, you can do whatever you want, but you don't want to end up in international arbitration depending on what you have agreed on with investors. So here you're talking about a very, very diversified pool, and I usually look at each case by case before providing an advice. But again, you know, companies acknowledge the trend, they acknowledge the need to do something to reduce the impact of their activities on the environment. And usually you find companies more understanding than perhaps what people think of the oil industry, because they want to stay in business for as long as possible, and just taking confrontational position doesn't help. And this is where they engage in perhaps renegotiation with governments to try to find a win-win solution, maybe accept some changes in return of alleviating some burden elsewhere. So it's never a black and white. There's lots of fine-tuning that happens all along.
I am looking at the comments on different social media channels, and I'm seeing people joining us from Brazil, from Morocco, from Indonesia, from Saudi Arabia, Congo, Mexico, all over the world.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. For those watching us live, if you have any questions for Carole, drop them in the comment boxes. Carole, I want to ask a question around the countries that are highly dependent on oil and gas. And you've touched on that a little bit, but for those like Saudi or the UAE, or what options do they have in the face of the energy transition that's taken a lot of attention?
This is an interesting area, because most of the stories that you hear about the economic outlook of these producers in the Middle East or elsewhere, and I'm thinking here about Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, some countries in Asia, particularly developing economies. Why I single them out? Because usually you have the economies hugely dependent on oil and gas revenues. The economy, government revenues, for example, Iraq at some point, or export revenues, more than almost 100% of export revenues come from oil. So when you think of the energy transition, perhaps the first thing that comes to your mind is that these countries are going to suffer, because the world doesn't want to buy anymore their oil or gas, and therefore they have no other substitutes to support the economy, and they will be in deep trouble. Anyway, any economy which is not diversified face problems, structural problems. So problems are already there in these countries. Now, this takes me to the second part of the argument about the energy transition. Well, again, here you have to take the time frame into perspective, because the energy transition, whatever you believe, there seems to be an agreement that's not going to happen overnight. So if you look at the energy transitions over the last maybe 2 centuries, you can see that they take time to happen. They take several decades to really materialize. And so far, hardly any fuel completely leave our energy mix. So you end up having a more diversified portfolio, but tilted towards a more certain fuels than the other. And because of that kind of time frame, add to that the fact that these countries that fuel this, especially in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia's of this world, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, for example, they have very low cost of production. So if I think conceptually of the energy transition as leading to a shrinking oil market, so a market which is getting smaller and smaller, then you would expect that the last to leave the market is the low-cost producer, whereas the first to leave the market would be the high-cost producer. Why? Because prices would face downward pressure, and therefore, if you cannot sustain low prices for a certain period of time, then you are out of business. So I'm more concerned about the high-cost producers. For the low-cost producers, such as those in the Middle East, actually, you end up having the following. If you have the global energy transition and the high-cost producers outside, let's say the Middle East, they just move away from oil and gas. The oil majors, the private oil companies, again, they move away from oil and gas. But the world still needs oil to sustain, our modern lifestyle, because it's not going to happen overnight. Actually, what will happen is the following. The world is going to end up relying more on Middle Eastern oil, not less. And even if those countries adopt the energy transition domestically, there they will end up with a virtuous cycle with respect to oil and gas, because what they end up doing, instead of consuming oil and gas domestically, as is the case today. So if you look at the energy mix in these countries, it's pretty simple. It's oil and gas, hardly any other source of energy produced and consumed locally. So when they are going to shift to other sources of energy, gradually they will free more oil that will be used more for exports. So in both cases, at least for the foreseeable future, as the energy transition happens, we're going to see the Middle East quite shielded from this shift away from oil and gas. And of course, at a certain point, they will have to join everybody else. They have to jump on the train. And this is why it's important from today. Actually, it was important many years ago, but perhaps today it's very important for them to pursue economic diversification so that they are not caught up too late. So it's a transitional period where, in my opinion, they can enjoy some golden era, but it doesn't mean that they are protected forever. If they don't diversify their economy, if they don't safeguard some of those revenues for the rainy days in the future, then yes, they will be in trouble. I'm not worried here about Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Kuwait. I'm more worried about other producers such as Iraq, even Oman, Angolas of this world, Nigerias of this world, where you have already weak structural problems in the economy.
Carole, as we're getting a bit close to wrapping up, I'd like to ask Shelby Dumaine, our social media star, to pull in some Q&A from the audience, perhaps. Shelby, Hey, Shelby, great to see you.
Hey, it's good to see you as well. I'm happy to be here. It's been so interesting already hearing the conversation. So I'm excited to get some of these other questions asked. So this first one I wanted to ask you is, when do you think we'll see peak oil demand, and what are your thoughts about that?
Wow, I mean, honestly, nobody knows. Even the most sophisticated forecasting models cannot give us a precise date of when that will happen. Peak oil demand was a big thing before COVID-19 and still is today. Some people who made some forecasts before COVID have revisited their models, and some of them kind of brought that date forward or nearer to where we are today. But when you compare again the forecasts and the scenarios of different agencies, oil companies, consultancies around the world, you hardly find any agreement on when peak oil demand will be reached. There are lots of assumptions also used when people are making this kind of forecast or scenario modeling. We know it's going to happen at some point, but we don't know when it is going to happen. And at some point, I think I found between two opposing scenarios a difference of more than 60 million barrels a day of oil demand. So if you think of oil demand today around 90 plus million barrels a day, then that is almost 3/4 of the current oil demand of difference in the estimate. And that is a big range of disparity between scenarios. But this gives you an idea about the uncertainties when it comes to forecasting peak oil demand. That said, although I say that it is going to happen at some point, but I don't know when, I want to take you back to the first decade of the century when people were talking about peak oil supply, and lots of books were published warning of the potential resource wars. When prices were increasing after 2008, people were saying, okay, that's the evidence that we are running out of oil and we're going to start killing each other to gain access to those resources. Who's talking about peak oil supply today? Hardly anyone. I'm not saying that it's necessarily going to happen to peak oil demand, but again, it's just to highlight how our forecast can be quite misleading because they are based on lots of assumptions, and some of them are technology adoption. For example, hardly anyone predicted the shale revolution, and the impact of the shale revolution is still with us today.
Yeah, and I want to echo what you said there also earlier on that the transition takes time. It takes decades to happen, and that's not going to happen overnight. So if you're counting on oil demand peaking in the next few years, then you probably need to recount.
And even if it peaks, Assaad, it's not going to disappear overnight. I mean, think of April 2020. Hardly anyone was driving, hardly anyone was traveling, and oil demand was still at a staggering, 75 to 80 million barrels a day. So this tells you that even if demand peaks, actually COVID-19 may have done oil companies a favor because it gave them a taster of how peak oil demand will look like if it hits. So that's why people have to understand that an oil demand peaking does not mean that we're going to stop consuming oil suddenly overnight. It simply means it can slow down and then decline, but gradually it can take ages to reach the level that people think it's going to happen overnight.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we actually have two audience questions on the topic of that transition. So this first one, what role do you think shale will play in energy transition?
Shale is just like any other oil, right? So it's oil. It's just the way you're extracting it that is different. So it will play the same role as any other, as oil in general. And as I said earlier, that we're not going to stop using oil. And of course, I would add to that gas. I use them together. So it will continue to play a role in terms of meeting world oil demand. I know many people today are skeptical about the potential or the future or the outlook of shale, but I have to admit that compared to last year, they are much more optimistic. So last year, people were calling shale in the US toast, that was over. And actually, I was one of the few out there saying that you shouldn't underestimate the power of the private sector, especially when when it's supported by the right institutional framework as you have in the US. And that's why we saw, as soon as prices started to recover sustainably, we saw a kind of recovery in shale production. Still not at the same level at when it peaked last year, but the recovery is happening, and we cannot rule out shale only on the basis of bankruptcies that happened in 2020. Actually, bankruptcies can simply mean a reinvigoration of the industry with new companies coming in, which are stronger and more efficient producers. So I don't think we heard the end of the story of shale. It was premature to write it off last year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so this last audience question, we talked a lot of energy transition basically is diversification, that they kind of go hand in hand. And so along that, what recommendations do you have for a lot of these oil-centric countries on their infrastructure development? How can they prepare or get ready for this diversification?
Look, it goes down. I will not pinpoint a particular sector, what they should do exactly in terms of support investment in agriculture or support investment in infrastructure or manufacturing. Governments, I think the main ingredients is that they should set up the right institutional framework. An institutional framework is like a big umbrella that encompasses different aspects, from the legislations to regulations to capable people at various ministries to run the sector or the economy. So if they set up properly the institutional framework and they embrace good governance, transparency, accountability, all these high-level principles, then investment will come to the country, and then investment will be directed to the sectors that might look most profitable for them. So there's a lot of homework to be done in those countries, and unfortunately, despite the massive body of advice that is out there free of charge, most of these governments turn a deaf ear to this kind of advice, especially when prices increase. So earlier we said that high oil prices can spell trouble to the private sector, to oil companies, but it can be also a curse for these countries because they lose sight of the much needed economic reform. So we find governments usually in developing countries which are dependent on oil and gas revenues, they announce ambitious reform agenda and very bold moves to diversify their economies when prices are low. But as soon as prices recover, they turn away from those reforms. And there's lots of evidence out there. I'm not imagining there. Just look at the announcements from the 70s until today and plot them against oil price, and you see a very nice relationship between the two. But hopefully today, the pressure of the energy transition will be strong enough to allow these governments to stick to their reform agendas.
Great insight there, Carole. I want to close with a last question to you. You've published a recent report about concerns in the next decade. What are some of the key trends you've uncovered in your study?
I'll be very happy to share it with you and with the audience. Actually, I'll announce it when it's out. It's based on a survey we did last year at Crystal Energy in collaboration with Aspen Technology on how COVID-19 has affected the industry's priorities and and strategy for the next 5 years and then 10 years. And there were lots of interesting findings. Some of them, of course, are predictable, but others actually, for me, were very surprising. For example, peak oil demand was not a major concern, not before the next 10 years at least. But there was two other aspects that caught my attention. First of all, everybody seemed to complain about the shortage of skills and that the industry should do a better job at attracting young talent. Because, when I talk to my students at universities, they are concerned about entering the oil and gas industry because they think there is no future for the industry. But because they prefer to go into the greener agenda. Now, so there are already justified, legitimate concerns. If they see that the industry starts laying off staff as soon as prices decline, oil prices decline, so you have this kind of cyclical trend in the industry, then of course they will be doubly shy from applying for a job in the oil and gas industry. So for those respondents who thought about shortage of skills as being a major concern, they also said that they also resorted to laying off staff when prices declined in order to support their economic performance. So in this respect, you have a kind of disconnect between those two, and the industry should really work hard on improving its retainment strategy especially for young talent, to attract them to the industry. The other aspect that also caught my attention, Assaad, is probably quite relevant to your audience, is how everybody put a great emphasis on digitalization. Actually, COVID-19 has created a new sense of urgency for the adoption of digitalization. And we can see it. Look at us. We're using a digital platform to reach out to a wide number of participants. But what most people kind of overlooked is the fact that cyber threats and cybersecurity were not seen as a concern. And that was for me a bit, puzzling, because if you want to go down the route of digitalization, if you want to embrace digitalization, you should acknowledge that it comes with a lot of threats. And the oil industry is particularly vulnerable to these kind of threats, cyber threats. Unfortunately, they are happening, but people don't talk about them. So that's something that people should really think about when they think about digitalization. Otherwise, you will face lots of problems down the road.
Carole, this has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation, very insightful feedback. I think we exceeded the time, but very joyfully. On behalf of the show and our audience, I'd like to thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me, and apologies for taking a long time, but you asked me lots of tricky questions, very timely. But again, if I may conclude by saying that we should go beyond just the headline news and look at various issues that you raised closely before reaching quite ambitious conclusions.
Carole, if somebody wants to connect with Crystal Energy, where do they go?
You can go on our website, so you can drop us a message on the website. And for me personally, you can also find me on social media, and you can reach me directly there, LinkedIn or Twitter.
Dr. Carole Nakhle, thank you for your time. And to our audience, thank you for being with us today on this insightful discussion with CEO of Crystal Energy, Dr. Carole Nakhle. We will see you next time. Take care.